Hello everyone, welcome to task for today. We are studying sociology through different tasks and we have reached the end of our foundation series of lectures. So today's task is on social change and it is task for today TFT number 25. We have studied about society and what society consists of. We have learned about social structure, and when we talk of society as a social system, then we see that it is composed of different social institutions. These institutions, the major ones are religion, polity, economy and kinship. When we think of social change, then we have to consider change in the social structure. So social change will be change in the social structure. That means change in different social institutions. So if there is a noticeable change in any of the social institutions, then we say that there is a social change. Now this noticeable change, by this we mean we should be able to see the impact on people. Also, this change should not be impulsive, but it should take place over a period of time. Only then can we say that society has changed or a particular society is undergoing social change. For this to happen, we need to understand that the impact should be high as well as it should take place over a period of time. So, what do we understand by social change in modern society? When we study society, when we study sociology, then we are in fact studying the changes which took place in modern society, and that is why sociology emerged. So the sociologists, they started studying the changes which were taking place in the modern society, and they studied different social organizations, social relationships, and the changes that the values and beliefs were undergoing. Now these changes happened because of change in the economy, culture, religion, polity. These organizations underwent certain changes. Now these changes, they were of two types. First was by internal forces, that means forces inside the society, and second was external force which was acting from outside. You must remember we were talking about environment while studying Parsons. When we studied about social system, then we read that a social system interacts with the environment. So when the social system undergoes certain change, then the forces can be either internal or external. And what does this change include? It includes a reordering or restructuring of social structure. So there is either a reordering. For example, if we are talking about hierarchy, then maybe there are certain changes in the hierarchy. There are certain upward movement, there are certain downward movement. Now Giddens, Anthony Giddens, he studies social change, and he says that while studying social change, we need to study how far there have been changes in the structure. That means what is the extent of change and how much time has elapsed since this change has been noticed. So the time factor is important, and the impact, that means the extent of change, should be taken care of. there is another point to be noticed while studying social change, and that is that when we are measuring social change, then there is something which is fixed. So we need to study not only the changes but also the parts of the society which are stable, which remain constant over a period of time. So while studying social change in modern society, we will be studying about the organizations, the relationships and changes in beliefs and values. What are the factors of social change, or what are the agents of social change? Here you would see that when we talk of two generations, let us say this is generation 1 and this is generation 2. When the older generation prepares the younger generation for the times ahead, then how does it do it? Through the vehicle of education. Education is the carrier of the belief system, the value system, and other knowledge about norms, rules to the younger generation. This can be done either through formal education or informal education. That means either through proper educational institutions or particular institution which is designed only to serve the purpose of education, and the other would be, for example, family members or elders who would educate the child and teach them about the norms, values, belief system, and they would pass on the culture to the newer generation. So education, it ensures stability in a society, but at the same time it is also a harbinger of change, or it is a vehicle which also brings about change. Now how does this happen? If you go back to the first few TFTs that we read about Newton and the law of gravitation. We read about the apple that fell from the tree and how Newton, when he was sitting under the tree, he observed that some force was pulling the apple downward, and that is why the apple fell down. So this was an observation, and then he conducted research and came up with a theory. And after this theory was finalized, it was tested many times, then it was included perhaps in the textbooks of people, of children, and it was passed on to the newer generation, and they read about this concept of gravitation. So this insight was added on to education, and it became a part of the knowledge of people. So earlier they had no knowledge about gravitation, but now they were knowledgeable and they knew about gravitation. So what happens when there is a transition from one generation to another? Then this knowledge goes on increasing. How? Because of advancement in education. And this is brought upon by intellectuals. They are the ones who are conducting research. They are the ones who are responsible in expanding the scope of education, and they are the ones adding on to the knowledge repository of people. And when there is a change in education, when there is an increase in education, when there is a growth of knowledge, then it starts affecting the different organizations of society. And what happens? There is a conflict which arises between different sections of people, different generations of people, because there would always be some people who would not accept this knowledge. And these conflicts which take place between people who accept the change and people who oppose the change lead to social change. And this knowledge also brings about social and cultural innovations, because people are more open-minded and they adopt newer forms of culture, or they come up with newer ways of doing things, they innovate, and these also with time they are expressed in the form of certain changes in society, certain changes in the social life of man, and then they become evident as social change. So you must remember that education forms the backbone of social change. Now, we talked about two forces of change. They were endogenous forces, which were internal to society, and the other was exogenous forces, which were external to society. So these are, let's say, social subsystems, and they undergo certain changes, and these changes are expressed in the form of social change. Similarly, there may be external forces which are acting on a society or social system, and then they bring certain changes. So let's see what are these changes. When we think of internal changes or changes due to endogenous forces, then they are mainly related to demography or population. Now, there may be either increase or decrease in population growth. For example, whenever there is a migration, then there will be an increase in population in the urban areas while decrease in population in the rural areas. Also, when people start practicing family planning, they go for contraceptive methods, then also the rate of growth decreases. Okay. Then infant and child mortality due to certain diseases, due to certain health factors or poor health practices, there may be an increase in infant and child mortality rate. Similarly, when care is not taken of a woman's reproductive health, or when they are not given proper treatment after the birth of the baby, then also maternal mortality rate increases. Some people also practice abortions. This also reduces the birth rate. And when the government introduces certain policies in order to bring social change, then this also is included in endogenous forces. Also, when a society adopts technology in doing work, then it introduces social change. This leads to mechanization of, let's say, agriculture. Certain social reform movements are very important in influencing the minds of people, and they spread awareness and lead to social change. Along with endogenous forces, there are forces which are external to society, and they are the ones which bring change in the society. For example, we had French and Russian revolutions or wars. Then we read about the Renaissance period, the Enlightenment, when change in thinking happened, change in intellectual ability of people. People became more open-minded, they accepted reason. Then feudalism broke down and a new type of economy was set up. Agriculture and industrial revolutions took place because of developments in science and technology, and there were radical changes in the lifestyle because of scientific and technological innovations, because now people could use machinery for their benefits, even for housework. and this made their job much easier. And there were trade relations between different nations, growing nations, and market economy came up. All of these were a result of new developments, new revolutions, and advent of advancement in science and technology. Now, when a change happens in a society, then do the people accept the change quickly, or there is a lag? There is a lag indeed, and this is referred to as cultural lag. This is mentioned by Ogburn and Nimkoff. They were the first one to observe that there are discrepancies taking place in many aspects of social life in many societies, and they measured the rate of social change, or the change in social and culture, and they found that there was a lag or disharmony between the rapid growth of technology and the slower transformation of family, political, and let's say traditional beliefs like religions. These adapted slowly to the changes. They did not accept the change immediately. They did not assimilate or internalize these changes immediately. But technology was the first to show this change, and it grew at a faster rate. But the different social institutions, they were slow to adapt this change, or slow to accept this change, because of which there was a lag known as cultural lag. Now, why does social change occur? Why are people not satisfied with their present society, and why do they want things to change? There are many factors, and some of these factors are given by Morris Ginsburg, and these are the forces of changes, or the reasons for change to happen. The first one is a conscious decision of the individuals to accept change. And one example is that of the nuclear family, which was prevalent in the Western society. And this was accepted by the other societies, and they also started going for nuclear or smaller families. Then there can be changes in the social and economic conditions. For example, people started migrating to urban areas because they could find no job in the rural areas, or perhaps the crop failed, or there was fragmentation of land and they had no land to till the soil, or they had no land to farm, because of which they went to the cities in search of employment. There could also be certain structural changes and structural strains, and this can happen because of change in technology. For example, mechanization of labor happened, and mechanization of agriculture. Now what happened? Most of the work was done by machines, because of which some of the farmers or some of the laborers, they lost their jobs and they migrated to cities. There can be external influences also. For example, because of foreign invasion. This also leads to social change. For example, the colonial rule, it brought in codification of laws, changed the administration, introduced railways, telegraphs, communication. The last point is by liberalization of policies. There can be social change. For example, economic liberalization. We opened our economy to foreign countries, and we changed the way we used to do economic trade. We changed the way we used to produce goods, and this changed our relations with other nations. Similarly, there can be many social reform movements. For example, removal of untouchability, introduction of Widow Remarriage Act, removal of sati. So we can say that change happens because we are influenced by other people and we like the way they do certain things. We also want to assimilate, we also want to accept their ways. We sometimes are attracted by better prospects, perhaps of a better lifestyle. We may also have certain problems in our present scenario and we want things to change, we want better days, and that is why social change happens. Now, what are the parameters of social change in developing countries? We have learned about modern societies and we have been studying modern society a lot. And among the modern societies, we were more interested in the Western countries. But now, the time has come for us to study about India and the developing nations in general. So, how do we measure social change in a developing nation? Firstly, we would measure it in the form of transition. Now, we remember that when we as a nation, we emerged from the clutches of the colonial rule, then we started thinking of development. We started thinking of self-independence, self-reliance. We started thinking about agriculture, industry, planning. So we were in a stage of transition, going through a lot of transformation in every sector of society, in different institutions, and all these changes brought change in the social structure. We faced changes in social institutions, in the value systems, and in the different subsystems of society. And we also changed the way of punishment, of promoting justice, and the previous laws were repressive. Then we learned about restitutive law. So we changed the way of social sanctions. We changed the way of imparting punishments. So this also constituted a change in society, social change, because it was a change in the legal system of our society. Now, social systems also change when there are certain movements, and during a struggle for independence, we came across such movements. They were known as social reform movements. For example, we realized that sati was not right, it was a social evil. We also were open-minded about widow remarriage, and we accepted the marriage of widows. So these also brought change in our society. Along with these changes, we also became integrated with the world economy, and we underwent liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And because of these forces, we changed the economic structure of our nation, and our relations of India as a developing nation changed with other developed nations. Also, the general international climate also defined us. For example, there was a Cold War, and at that time we understood that we had to take a stand, and we came up with non-aligned movement. So all these factors have led to social change in our nation, and these changes also apply to other developing nations. Therefore, when we think of social change, we would consider us or developing nations as those nations in transition and nations which used to experience many social evils, and also the experience of external forces, of Western forces, as well as the international climate. Now we will start with the theories of social change. First theory of social change is the evolutionary theory. Evolution, if you remember, it comes from biology, and we remember about Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, how survival of fittest was the concept which drove change and which brought about evolution. Similarly, Spencer, he drew an analogy between social and organic growth, and he said that just as an organism grows, evolves because of the principle of survival of fittest, similarly a society also which survives change grows and evolves into a more developed society. Now, the principle of change, what does it say? It says that the present system that we have is the outcome or the result of more or less continuous modifications from its original state. This means, let us say, if this is stage 1, then because of certain changes, the society reached stage 2, and finally it has reached stage 3. Thus, this direction of change is linear. It is going in one direction. Now, Comte, he says that a society changes because of 3 stages. The first stage is the theological stage, second is the metaphysical, and third is the positivistic, which we study about in sociology. Similarly, Durkheim also gives the concepts of mechanical and organic solidarity and compares primitive and industrial societies, and he says that with time society develops and differentiates and comes to a specialized division of labor, and thus forming a organic society or organic solidarity. He says that societies progress over time and they finally reach a point where they industrialize in the manner of the Western nations. Now, there are certain new evolutionary theories. They say that the change, this direction of change, is not towards industrialization but towards a more elaborate division of labor. So there are 2 theorists, first the evolutionary and second the neo-evolutionary. For evolutionary, they mention about industrialization. They say that society starts from primitive society and finally reaches a point where it industrializes or achieves industrialization. But the neo-evolutionists, they say that it is division of labor which decides the level of development. Second is the cyclical theory. In the cyclical theory, the stress is on rise and fall of civilizations. It was given by Spengler, Toynbee and Sorokin. For Spengler, each civilization is like a biological organism. So, the cycle followed is of a life cycle. It starts with the birth, maturity, old age, and finally death. So this also includes the concept of rise and fall, or you can say growth and decay. Let us say an organism is born, then a society is born, then it grows, reaches a certain maturity, and finally dies or decays. So that is how social change is measured. For Toynbee, he says that the social change is measured in terms of challenge and response. Every society faces certain challenges and it comes with certain responses to these challenges, and some of these challenges it may be able to overcome, while other challenges it may not be able to overcome. So these define, the responses define the social change in a society. The third thinker, Sorokin, he says that any society fluctuates between two types of culture. First one is the materialistic culture or the sensate culture. Second is the religious or spiritual culture, which is the ideational culture. So he says that any society keeps changing between these two types of cultures, and their ultimate aim is to reach idealistic culture, or a culture which is a blend of materialism as well as spiritualism. But no society reaches this stable position, and instead it keeps on oscillating between these two cultures. So cyclical theory means a particular society always goes through different cycles of either rise or fall, birth or death, or between two kinds of cultures. Third type of theory is by the structural functionalists, or the equilibrium theory given by Talcott Parsons. He stresses on differentiation and integration. He says that simple societies were undifferentiated. That means all the functions were done by one social institution. For example, if we consider family, then in a simple society, it was responsible for the functions of reproduction, economy because it was a unit of production. It was also responsible for education. It was responsible for taking care of children. It was responsible for birth of children, the health of children. But in a complex society, these functions are distributed evenly. So a society goes on the process of differentiation, and family is only responsible for reproduction. The other functions, on the other hand, for example, production or its responsibility of a unit of economy is delegated to or passed on to a factory. Education is given to schools. Recreation or taking care of children is given to creche, while the birth or health is given to hospitals. So this is what Talcott Parsons says, that these constitute social change. But after differentiation comes the process of integration. Parsons says that in order to ensure that this differentiation does not lead to a chaos or disorder in society, there are certain institutions which act as bridge between the newly differentiated social structures, and these are the bridging institution. For example, law courts, they ensure that there is no difference between the different structures which emerge after differentiation. This process is known as integration, and this ensures social stability or social order in society. That is why this theory is also known as equilibrium theory. The fourth theory is the conflict theory, given by Karl Marx and George Simmel. They highlight the forces which produce instability, struggle, and social disorganization. As you remember Marx, he studied about historical materialism and the class conflict. He studied about the differences of means of production between haves and have-nots, and he said that finally there would be a proletarian revolution due to class consciousness and emergence of the working class as a force, and finally they would rule over the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat would be the rulers, and they would bring a new society into being, which would be known as the communist society. And in this society there would be communal ownership of the means of production, and it would ensure stability in the society. George Simmel followed along the lines of Karl Marx. He said that conflict is a permanent feature of society, and in a society, social change includes continuous conflicts. And this conflict, it encourages people of similar interests to unite together in order to achieve their objectives. The next part is development and dependency. We have certain theories. Let us look at them. First one is market-oriented theories. The market-oriented theories say that economic growth is possible only in the case of unrestricted capitalism. That means an economy or a society will grow economically or will progress or flourish only when it allows capitalism into its society. And also this capitalism should be unbridled, it should not be restricted, there should be no restriction on capitalism in society. Now how does this happen? This happens in the rich countries, in the high income countries, and it cannot happen in low income countries. Now why it cannot happen? Because in a low income country, the government interferes with the economy, and this interference in the market leads to blockage in the economic development. This theory was given by Rostow. He said that low income societies can develop economically only if they give up their traditional ways. That means only if they modernize. And how they can modernize? By adopting modern economic institutions, technologies, and cultural values. They said that the traditional societies were fatalistic. That means they accepted their fate, they accepted the hardship that they were going through, and because they assumed or they thought of this suffering as unavoidable or unchangeable, and that is why they accepted their fate. And this acceptance led to discouragement, and it deterred them, it discouraged them into working hard or working for savings or for any productive investment. They thought that we are anyway not going to get anything, we will remain in this lower class only, so why should we save, why should we invest? This was the mentality of those people who were living in the traditional society or the low income societies. Market oriented theories say that this plight, this suffering of traditional societies can end only if modernization is allowed to come in the society. And in this process, the wealthy countries can help them. How? Because the wealthy countries can provide finances, they can provide loans, they can provide advices for economic growth. And how will this economic growth happen? By improvement in technology, mass communication can come up, factories can be set up, and these low income countries will grow economically. Thus, market oriented theories, they promoted free economy in the traditional societies in order to bring social change or to ensure development. Second was the dependency theory. It was the opposite of the market oriented theories. It was built on the theories of Karl Marx, and these theorists, they said that the low income countries, they were poor because they were exploited by the wealthy countries and also the multinational corporations. Now, how did this exploitation begin? It began when capitalism entered these nations along with colonialism. When the colonial rule was established in these nations, then they extracted raw material and they also took the help of cheap labor, and they exploited both the raw materials as well as labor in these colonies. And even after World War II, when decolonization happened, this exploitation did not stop. So what happened? After the colonial rulers left their colonies, the transnational corporations came into the picture, and these MNCs, they opened new branches in these erstwhile or former colonies, and in the name of liberalization, privatization and globalizations, a new market economy came into play. These MNCs, they established factories and they used the cheap labor of these new nations. They also used the raw materials, and because of liberalization, the government which was placed in these new nations, it did not interfere, and these low income nations had to open their economies to the MNCs. Because of the low prices of labor as well as raw materials, they could not accumulate wealth, and the local businesses could not flourish, could not compete with the products of the foreign companies, and because of this, the low income countries, they became more poorer and they finally had to borrow from the rich countries. This introduced an element of economic dependency. So instead of becoming economic independent, they were now dependent on the rich countries or the Western nations or the former colonial masters. The third theory is by the world system theorists. Immanuel Wallenstein and his colleagues have put forth this theory, and according to them, the world system can be divided into 4 parts. First is the world market, which is the seller and buyer of goods and services, labor. Second is the division of world system into 2 classes, the capitalists and the workers. The third type of classification is in the formal and informal political relationships between different nations, especially the powerful nations which drive or dictate the terms of world system or world economy. The third type of classification is of 3 unequal economic zones. The first economic zone is of core countries who are the most advanced and industrial countries. Second is the low income or agricultural countries, they are the peripheral countries. And the third type is the semi-peripheral countries who are semi-industrialized and middle income countries. So Wallenstein, he discusses the development in the world in the relations of dependency between the peripheral countries and the core countries, as well as semi-peripheral countries. The fourth theory is the state-centered theories. This theory you would be able to relate with. It speaks of those nations in which state plays an important role in promoting growth. This includes the East Asian region. According to these theorists, without an effective state, sustainable development, whether it is economic or social, it is impossible without effective state or without the involvement of state. In the East Asia, there were few nations which emerged or industrialized. They were known as the newly developed nations or newly decolonized nations. They came to be known as the newly industrialized countries during the 1980s and 90s. These were China, India, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines and other nations. And the major factor which was responsible for the economic growth of these nations was a strong government. Here, the East Asian government acted aggressively, sometimes to ensure political stability. Because for any nation to develop, the political system needs to be stable. Also, they ensured that the labor cost was low, because of which there was a high profit. The second factor was the East Asian governments. They steered economic development in desired directions. So they were the ones who gave direction to the growth. And finally, they were also involved in various social organizations or social welfare programs. For example, housing programs, housing schemes, educational schemes. So, in India also, you can say that development happened because the government was willing. It was interested to bring development in the nation. Therefore, after going through all these theories, you can see the differences in the perspective of change or development from different angles, from the Western angle, from the developed nations, from the developing nations point of view, from the West, from the East. And then if you have to write about different theories of change, you can include a balanced perspective. Next is social change in India. We will start with a quote by late Professor Yogendra Singh. He studied intensively about social change in India. He wrote a book which has become quite famous, Modernization of Indian Tradition, and he studied about social structure and the changes which took place in the Indian society. And he said that when we speak of social change in India, then are the forces of change such that they strengthen India's emergence as a nation state? Why did he mention this? Because India is a land of differences. So naturally, if forces of change act on Indian nation or Indian society, it may cause certain disbalance in the society, certain differences in the society, weakening of perhaps social bonding, So, how do we ensure that this change that India goes through does not weaken Indian social fabric, but it strengthens Indian state? So the next point that he says is that, do these forces threaten its evolution due to uneven or contradictory outcomes of process of social change? So, is there a strengthening or is there a weakening of society? What kind of crisis can we expect? Does Indian society, its institutional structure and past tradition, inherit a vitality? Does Indian society show resilience to overcome the processes of disintegration in order to become integrated social change? So, what does this mean? It means that, let us assume that India is a nation of diversity. There are certain forces which act on India. Then what happens to this unity? Does India get disintegrated or it remains integrated under the force of this change? Are we resilient enough? That means, can we absorb the shock of these forces? Can we bounce back when we come under certain forces? Can we bounce back and stand up once again as a united nation, is what Professor Yogendra Singh was trying to say. Yogendra Singh is the thinker or the Indian thinker that you would look up to when studying social change in India. While studying social change, he gave two forces in order to study Indian society, and these forces, as we have studied before also, they were the internal forces as well as external forces. Internal forces were known as endogenous forces, while external forces were known as exogenous forces. And endogenous forces formed orthogenetic patterns, while exogenous forces, they were the forces known as heterogenetic contacts. That means contact of the Indian society with external forces. When changes took place in the Indian society, or which were internal to the Indian society, then the phenomenon was known as traditionalization, while when the Indian society came in contact with external forces, then the change which took place was known as modernization. And the change which Yogendra Singh studied in India was a linear evolutionary type of change. This change was from traditionalization to modernization. That means, first of all, we study about how traditions in India developed, or they were institutionalized in Indian society. And when we became strong enough as a traditional society or as a nation with a particular tradition, then we came in contact with external forces, and under which we also became modern. He gave the concept of little and great tradition. He said that the little tradition is the tradition which is followed by the folks of unlettered peasants. That means not educated or illiterate, and this tradition is unrecorded and it is transmitted orally. How? through folk artists, medicine men, tellers of riddles, proverbs, stories, poets and dancers, and it is confined to a limited sphere. For example, there are certain religions or cultures from Telangana. They form the little tradition. But great tradition is the tradition which is upheld by the elite or the reflective few, that means the intellectuals. These are in the form of classical text or scriptures, and they are transferred through proper channels. For example, teachers, reciters or ritual leaders. They have a broader extent. Examples of greater tradition would be Hinduism, Buddhism and Jainism. These concepts of little and great traditions were given by Robert Redfield, and they influenced Milton Singer and McKim Marriott. Now, Yogendra Singh first describes the process of traditionalization through orthogenetic process or internal process. Now, how did this happen? He says that, as mentioned in the previous slide, there are two kinds of traditions. One is the little tradition, other is the great tradition. So, when changes happen from the little tradition to the great tradition, then the process is known as universalization. So, how does this happen? When the elements of the little tradition, like the indigenous customs, deities and rites, they circulate upward to the level of the great tradition. That means they are adapted by the, let's say, the elite class. Some of the elements of the little tradition, they are taken up by the elite, then they are assimilated in the great tradition and they become a part of the great tradition. This is known as universalization. An example would be Sanskritization. But when some of the greater tradition or great tradition elements, they travel below and they form the people belonging to the little tradition, they come up with local forms of these rituals, then this process is known as parochialization. So, these newer forms of traditions, they lose much of their original form. So, when some parts of the little tradition are taken up by the greater tradition, then it is known as universalization, while when some parts of the greater tradition, they are modified and they are assimilated into the little tradition, then it is known as parochialization. For example, desanskritization. Yogendra Singh, he has written a book, as mentioned before, Modernization of Indian Tradition. You are advised to read chapter 1 from that book. In that chapter, he studies the approaches of social change by S.C. Dubey, A.R. Desai, M.N. Srinivas and his own view, and he comes up with an integrated view of social change. And this is the integrated approach. Here he mentions about the traditionalization that we studied in the previous slide, and then he says that after traditionalization, modernization also happens. Now this is the process through which it happens. Modernization happens when our society comes in contact with Islam or Western power or colonial power. So these are the two forces which were mainly responsible for introducing modernization to Indian society. So first of all, they take place in the little tradition where Islamization happens, and in the great tradition the secondary Islamic impact. Then in the westernization, in the little tradition first the primary westernization happens, and then secondary westernization in the great tradition or the modernization. Similarly, when we talk of traditionalization, then when the little tradition is adopted by the greater tradition, it is Sanskritization. And finally, the greater tradition, it undergoes cultural renaissance. Yogendra Singh also mentions about two different structures. One is the microstructure and second is the macrostructure. This is to study the social structure. And he says that in the microstructure, the roles are differentiated. That means it is at a smaller scale. But when these changes accumulate, then they form change in the political sphere. Similarly, at the micro level, there may be new legitimations, but at the higher level, a new structure of elite, bureaucracy, industry may happen. Similarly, when we talk of internal forces, then the changes may be migration or population shift. But when we are talking of macro structure, that means larger structures, then we are talking about elite circulation. You remember power elite? Then we have kings, then rise and falls of cities. So you just need to remember that micro means on a smaller scale, smaller institutions, while macro means larger institutions of society. For example, polity, economy, smaller institutions or smaller structures will be on the level of family, village, all these. The last portion is challenges to social transformation. First challenge is rapid urbanization. Rapid urbanization took place because of unemployment and migration to urban areas, but it led to a lot of problems. First was a decay in environment, health concerns, growth of slums, shortage of clean drinking water, poor sanitation, traffic hazards, overcrowding, haphazard development, insufficient services, let's say of education, medical facilities. So, the urban environment started decaying, or there was a degradation in the urban environment. This was a negative effect of rapid urbanization or social change. While studying urbanization, there is a term that you should know, which is urbanism. Whenever a new urban area is formed, then it comes up with certain characteristics. First is its impersonality. This term was used by Louis Wirth. He says that while in rural areas, you may see that people know each other because they are related either through kinship ties or because they know each other through their villages, through their relations, occupational relations. But these type of relations need not necessarily exist in urban areas, which is why there is an element of impersonality. People need not know each other. They are impersonal, indifferent in urban areas. This is what is meant by urbanism. There are many other features also, but this is a prime feature of urbanism given by Louis Wirth. Second effect of industrialization, of change, of increasing use of technology is risk society. Rapid social change leads to environmental concerns. There is an increase in the pollution level. in the accumulation of wealth, waste. There is no means to dispose of solid waste, nuclear waste, e-waste. Global warming comes into picture. There is climate change. Then, in agriculture, genetically modified food is produced. People are interested in yielding variety of seeds. Nanotechnology comes into play because of advancement in technology, and now people demand smaller chips, smaller gadgets, and here nanotechnology is used widely. But these affect society. These lead to a risk in the society, and this society is known as a risk society. This concept of risk society was given by Ulrich Beck. He said that rapid urbanization or rapid globalization leads to rapid technological change, and these change bring about newer forms of risk. These risks are not only confined to environmental concerns, but they also have other aspects also. For example, the employment patterns change. There is a heightened or increase in job insecurity. There is a declining influence of tradition and custom, because of which people become confused about their identity. The traditional family structure deteriorates, and personal relationships change. Okay, there is more freedom, there is more choice, therefore there is more democracy in personal relationships. Also, getting married, for example, is more risky, because earlier marriage was a lifelong institution, but now it has become a temporary institution. People are going for live-in relationships, people are going for single parent livelihoods or single parent households. They are no more interested in a spouse. Therefore, the marriage as an institution is suffering. Also, decisions about education is also coming up as risky, because now in the new society, the society is changing at such a pace that we do not know whether our skills would be obsolete tomorrow. What if I take up a course and C++ and tomorrow C++ is no more relevant? What would happen to my education? Therefore, the new society, the new modern society is full of so many risks. Another thinker or astronomer, Martin Rees, he gave the concept of manufactured risk. He said that although we are developing with the help of technology, this has also brought the question of survival of humanity, because now these developments may lead to nuclear holocaust, because we have a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons, that the day is no more far when we will fight on the basis of a nuclear weapons, and finally nothing would be left. The terrorists also, they may use biological weapons, or there may be certain errors in laboratory which may create new disease. So this he said in 2003, and you can see that these are very much relevant today. The concept of manufactured risk, because we are the people who have manufactured the risks of the modern society. So these two thinkers, please do as the after effect or side effect of rapid social change. Another challenge to social transformation is the concept of aging. We have reached a society, or we are in an era where norms are losing their hold over society. Families are degrading. The institution of marriage is losing significance. In such uncertain times, it is difficult for old parents or aged parents to find a security in the home, because now families are becoming nuclearized and even marriages are not permanent. So, what is the future of the aged? What do we understand by aging? Now, aging, it does not only refer to the biological process, it also refers to the psychological and social process that affects people as they grow older. So, when people grow older, they do not only age in terms of biology, but mentally also they age, and socially also they face certain challenges. You are not required to read these theories. Go through the issues, the problems which the aged face. They may suffer from different diseases. They may not have any medical insurance, any social security. They may be abused. They may suffer from learning issues, cognitive issues. They may suffer from isolation, poverty. These people, the elderly, they are discriminated or prejudiced because of their age, and this phenomenon is known as ageism. They suffer from emotional loneliness because there is no intimate confidant. Also, they suffer because of generational differences. Their needs are different from the needs of the younger generation. Similarly, they are lonely because they do not have a social network. They might not even have a social security. They may not have anything economically or any assistance economically, because now they cannot work. They are disabled because of age factor. They cannot work. So how do we ensure security to these people? How do we ensure stability in their lives? What can be done to assimilate them in society? What can be done to include them in our rapidly changing society, in a normless society, in a society where family and marriage are losing importance? There are many social issues that are to be read. First one is regarding women and child issues. How, because of increasing child and infant mortality, female feticide, female infanticide, the child ratio or sex ratio is decreasing. Women are facing many violences, for example, rape, sexual harassment at work, domestic violence or molestation. Even the reproductive health of women is not taken care of. People who are from the below poverty line, they do not understand the importance of reproductive health, because of which women die soon after giving birth. So here education is very much important. Now there are other conflicts also between different castes, between different religions, between people of different ethnicities as well as regions. What should the government do so that all these people are benefited equally through processes of change. What should be done so that the social change or social development is inclusive? How can we ensure social inclusion of people of different genders, age groups, caste, ethnicity, religion, region? How do we ensure social inclusion? Can we go for education? Can we go for positive discrimination, reservation? Is EWS helpful? What are the benefits or demerits of reservation? How can we ensure equal employment opportunities, educational employment opportunities? How can we utilize the social media to reach to different sections of society? How can we ensure digitization can reach to people from different social backgrounds? What changes can be done in citizenship laws so that even the refugees feel that they are a part of India or they are given certain basic rights? How can we include people as we progress? How can our social change be an integrated social change? So, please think on all the questions, all the differences or different perspectives that we studied today. And there are many reference materials that you can refer to. First one is by IGNOU. There are 2-3 booklets for social change. Then there is a book for social movements by C.N. Shankar Rao, but its PDF is not available. Then there are few chapters that are to be done from Sociology by Anthony Giddens. They are global inequality. You have to read the development theories. You have to read about urbanism from cities and urban spaces, and risk society from the environment and risk. All the social problems you will find in this book by Ramahuja, and Modernization of Indian Tradition by Yogendra Singh, you will be doing chapter 1. That is all for today, and these are the chapters which someone asked, which are to be done from these 2 books. Please read them once, all of these. Try to build your concepts first. Try to grasp. Do not hurry and do not stress if you are not able to understand, if you are not able to remember. Focus on understanding, right? And Anthony Giddens is a very good book, and it will give you the depth that your answer requires. So we have reached the end of the foundation series of the TFTs, and we are planning to start the TFTs again, which would be detailed, but we are going to do them after a break. So the current time is for you to start with the PYQs or previous year's papers, start writing answers, start completing all your backlogs, revise what you have studied, and if you want, you can also start note making. Please utilize the month of January for all of these, and then please also start your preparation for prelims. Do not think that you will complete the prelims portion in the last 2 months. Please understand the dynamic nature of the prelims papers and start preparation right away. And we hope to meet you in our next series of TFTs. Please subscribe to our channel and our group, And thank you so much for being with us. We wish you a great journey with sociology and with us, and we hope we will be able to guide you better. All the best. Thank you so much. Best wishes. Goodbye.